Alright, welcome. My name is Dean Lee. Welcome to the Facility for Rare Isotope Beams, or FRIB as we like to call it. This public talk is part of an initiative at FRIB called the Advanced Studies Gateway. The purpose of the Advanced Studies Gateway is to bring together researchers, innovators, creative thinkers, artists, and performers from all fields, and to tie Michigan State University with the community. We are honored today to have Professor Noam from Harvard University, the Department of Mathematics, as our speaker this evening. Professor Elkies has the distinction of being the youngest person ever tenured at Harvard. His research on elliptic curves, lattices, and other aspects of number theory have been recognized with the Presidential Young Investigators Award of the National Science Foundation and the Prix Picot of the Collège de France. He has also been playing piano and composing since the age of 3. He studied piano with Ari Vardi in Israel and Jay Carlson at Juilliard Pre-College. His composition teachers included Sadai, Davidovsky, and Kirshner. Noam is also known as a solver and composer of chess problems and won the World Chess Solving Championship in 1996. This evening, he will be speaking about canonical forms, a mathematician's view of musical canons. Before beginning the program, I would like to take care of a few administrative items. In the very unlikely event of a fire alarm or some emergency, we should exit the building through the doors from which you came. And please now turn your attention to the end of the program booklet. There you will see information where you can sign up for our email for future events and give us feedback through the online survey. The very last administrative item is to remind you to silence your phones if you have not done so already. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Noam Elkies.
Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful introduction and for the invitation to come back here for the second time. I gave a series of math lectures here quite a few years ago and haven't had the occasion to visit here since then, so I'm happy to do so in the new facility for research, for rare isotope, etc. And to use the piano that was generously donated to FRIB by Dean Lee's wife, Young, I believe is in the audience. Yes, I'm going to be discussing musical canons, and just to be clear about what I'm talking about, these are the kind of canons that, is this thing on?
You just shake the touch here.
Sorry. It's asking for your rare login. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that.
Okay, just to be clear, this is not the kind of canons that go boom. And there is, of course, mathematics that has been understood in some way since the days of Archimedes of those canons, although we understand more about air resistance and so forth nowadays. But canons in the musical sense, such as Frère Jacques, which, to remind you, goes something like this. Thanks. The remarkable thing here, I claim, is not that I've been doing what Jay Leno used to call a stupid human trick by humming one melody and whistling another one at the same time, but the remarkable musical fact that the melody and harmony are the same, separated by a few musical octaves, but we hear that I was whistling and going down 3 octaves, what I was humming down here are the same melody, but I was not going I was waiting for one musical unit of time to go by before starting the humming, and then the bass part in this case was going going at always one unit of time before. So that's what makes this a canon, specifically a canon in two parts, because there is like, you know, the whistling part and the humming part. And this particular tune works also as a canon in three parts, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to try to produce the third part with just my body, so 2, 3, and it can even be done in 4 parts, etc. And so you can try a 5th part also, but it turns out that the tune is too short, and if you try to sing a 5th part, you're just repeating the first, you're just doing the repeat of the first part. But it's a canon in 2, 3, or 4 parts, and so I'm going to be spending the next hour or so giving some examples, but eventually explaining how one goes about constructing these canons. And perhaps before going at the how, I should address the why. I mean, why do we have these canons? It might seem like a somewhat strange constraint on a piece of music to have the same tune be the tune and both the harmony and the melody. And yet, we've had canons almost as long as we've had notated music. At least notated Western music. For whatever historical reason or accident, Western music is the only musical tradition to have developed counterpoint, which is to say, not just a tune or various people singing the same tune together, or maybe, you know, some kind of harmony and a tune above it, but actually several voices, each one singing its own melody. Where besides the tune that on top, you also have on the bottom, which has some musical interest on its own. It's called counterpoint because, well, ancient Latin roots, music was originally notated in just points that became eventually the familiar notes. And then you have one point, punctum, against another. It's punctum contra punctum, point counterpoint, which eventually became shortened to counterpoint, just like this instrument was originally called a pianoforte. This could say it could play both piano softly and forte loudly, and pianoforte was a big mouthful, so people just called it piano. But essentially, counterpoint means you have 2 or more tunes being played at once. And of course, if you're going to have 2 tunes being played at once that are the same tune, off by a few beats, you'd better know how to write, you know, 2 unrestricted tunes. So that's why we only have a melodic counterpoint in the West, but other traditions have rhythmic counterpoint, even if they don't have melodic counterpoint. And so, for example, have any of you heard this piece called Clapping Music by Stephen Reich? Yeah. Oh, good. A few hands are going up. I'm not going to ask you to demonstrate. This apparently was his notation of what's basically a more or less standard rhythmic game in parts of Africa, where you have 2 people clapping the same rhythm together, and then at some point, one of them does the same thing, the other does the same thing, but waits a bit, and then does it 2 beats off. So, in some sense, those kinds of rhythmic canons could be described in the same way I describe melodic canons, but it's easier to see and hear what's going on when we're discussing melodic canons. And I've said these have been with us almost as long as we have notated music. One of the earliest pieces of British music we have is called Summer is coming in, summer has come in. which is a 4-part canon already. We only have it surviving because one of the monks who notated this paper, parchment was expensive, then you don't waste it on trivial, songs in praise of summer. Oh, okay, I'm going to say to write some Christian dogmatic text, and so forth, and so the tune survives that way. But names that you have heard of course, Bach wrote canons, but lots of people you might not expect to write canons. Mozart. So there is one of his many piano sonatas. Happens to have the question number 576 if you want to look it up afterwards. If you don't remember 576, people who are fond of playing with numbers might recognize this is a rather special number. There is no anything special about 576. It happens to be exactly a square, and the number it's a square of is what mathematicians sometimes call 4 factorial. This says the product of all the numbers from 1 to 4. If you don't remember 576, ask Google for 1 times 2 times 3 times 4, all that squared, and it will tell you 576. But that's just a serial number. It means that Mozart wrote 575 pieces before he wrote that one that we know of. And that one is a piano sonata that starts and then it goes on its paces for a while, and eventually, as these pieces do, he has to go from this key that we are in D major, he has to find his way to A major, which he does. Well, that might be the way I'd have written it if I was writing the piece. This is boring in the sense that it's just the right and left hands playing the same thing together. But that's not what Mozart wrote. Mozart said, okay, right hand and left hand are going to play exactly the same thing, but not together. The left hand is going to wait a musical quantum of time that we call an eighth note, and instead of just doing this, that's a lot more interesting. So that makes it one kind of canon. It's a kind of canon that we might and Mozart might have called a catch or a caccia. Like chicken cacciatore is chicken in the manner of cacciatore, somebody who catches for a living, somebody who's a hunter. And caccia or catch, the idea of being that one voice started just a bit late and is trying to catch up to the voice in front of them, and of course can't ever make it because of the same reason that you can never make it to your older brother or sister's age. They're always however many years ahead of you they started this game, and the same thing happening here. Oh, there we go again. Sorry. Yeah, thanks. So there's this high-spirited, pretend, playing at a catch. It could also be more of a, what's the word? A pleasant conversation where, the two voices are trading ideas back and forth. So Beethoven in the Fourth Symphony. Or the same kind of rhythm, but a different style of music in the last movement of Franck's sonata. So in case you want to look up these afterwards and have an easier time remembering things that you have seen written down, it's Beethoven Fourth and the Franck sonata. I'm not going to specify for what instrument because it's been played by, well, it's always piano and something, but it was originally violin, and it's been done with flute, and it's been done with cello, and I have done it with clarinet. And the last movement always starts like this. That's the piano part, and there is it's accompanying the violin. actually. The whole first page and the whole last page are this extended canon, which is just this, pleasant and somewhat romantic conversation between the two partners, as it were. And each one of these canons has been pretty clear if you hear it that there's a canon going on. One voice is doing one thing, the other voice is doing the other thing. And you might think, okay, composers are doing this to show off how good they are at counterpoint. They're going to impose this additional constraint on themselves, and why do they do it? Because the constraint is there. Because the same reason that people climb Mount Everest or do however many pull-ups in a minute. I just saw that there was a new Guinness World Record. Somebody managed to do 68 pull-ups in a minute, which I think, never mind that. And I think his name is Adamson there, but that's another story. And so one way to show that it's not just a matter of showing off is here is an example from another classical composer who, after Bach, is the most likely to be writing canons, which is Brahms, and this is from his clarinet sonata, let's say. And this sounds something like this. Again, the top part is going to be the clarinet, everything else is piano. You see clarinet sonata, it's almost always clarinet and piano. So here, it's something like this. Here, yeah, it's sort of the same rhythm, a beat or two back behind. But it doesn't sound like an exact melodic canon until you strip everything away except the clarinet part and the bass all the way at the bottom. So instead of playing the whole piano accompaniment to the chords, I'm just going to play the bass parts now. Now you can hear it's exactly the same tune, and it goes all the way up to here, but it's all hidden in this lush harmony. So you have to look at the score and notice what the bass part is actually doing before you can actually even tell there's a canon. People don't show off and then hide the fact that what it is that they're showing off about. So this is not just a matter of Brahms at the end of his life. This is like opus 111 something, not 111, 110 and something, maybe it's even 121 by now, and he doesn't have to prove anything to anybody by then. So there are other and better reasons than just showing off for writing canons. And there are various ways of saying what it is. If we're thinking about, I mentioned already, counterpoint was originally a matter literally of voices, several people singing together. And if you think of counterpoint, I mean, one of the origin myths of counterpoint is that people are trying to sing together, and one of them was out of tune, and so instead of singing, they sang being, moving in parallel fifths or fourths, whatever the interval was. Some of the earliest music we have recorded, polyphonic music we have recorded, is more or less in parallel, and then maybe they realize that they're out of tune and coming together, and so you have people going more or less in parallel and then converging. And if the origin of counterpoint is people singing out of tune, maybe the origin of, and usually it sounds terrible, but every once in a while there's a beneficial mutation, as the geneticists like to call it, and it actually survives and becomes more interesting. Maybe the origin myth of canons is that people are singing the same tune but out of time with each other. And usually it sounds, just bad, like you will hear soon when I explain why it's something. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. But every once in a while, you actually get something interesting out of it. But more to the point, and even instrumental music, whenever you're playing, be it a violin or a wind instrument or even this complicated machine of a piano, one of the things your teachers always tell you is that you are imitating a voice in some sense. You should imagine you're singing the phrase, and that tells you how to phrase it and where to breathe, how to phrase it. All of these things come from, speech or song. And different tunes can be like different characters. If there is you have a typical, kind of classical piece, be it a sonata or variations, where you have different parts of the piece, but they're also distinguished by different characters. You can imagine, this beginning already being conversation, the character now, no, please don't, or whatever the text is. And the remarkable thing about a canon is that you can have two voices singing together. That happens all the time, in opera or even in popular music. But here you have, so these are different characters interacting with each other. Here you have the same character interacting with itself, taking two or more roles in the conversation at once. So that's something you can do in music that you can't really do except in some kind of science fiction and not in a play and not in other kinds of literature, is that you have literally the same character taking several roles. Or in the less philosophical mode, you might say, well, in writing in canons using the same basic musical materials for both the tune and the harmony and the supporting parts is a way of having a piece of music be somehow organic, as composers like to say it, like everything is made up of the same basic materials, even things which seem to have very different functions like tunes and supporting parts and harmonic lines. But putting this aside, the main story I want to tell today is not so much, philosophizing about canons or even giving you a catalog of some of my favorite canons, although you'll certainly be hearing some of them, but some insight about how one goes about actually composing these, which is literally how does one go about putting together in this case, a musical canon. And I'm going to do it in a way that will not require you to know much about music notation. In principle, you won't have to know anything about music notation, except for the very fact that whatever code music is written in, you read it usually from left to right like you read English. So when I write A, B, C, D, it will not be literally the notes A, B, C, D, at least it doesn't have to be those notes. It just has to be some bits of music that follow each other. Oh, you can't see this. I got it. Can you see it now? Yeah. It doesn't have to be literally the notes A, B, C, D. It's just some chunks of music that follow each other in the series. And if I write two of these lines, one on top of the other, if I write two of these lines, one on top of the other, maybe I should just keep every once in a while hitting some key here, right? Okay, sorry. I should have practiced this earlier. That will mean that anything that happens on different lines but in the same vertical alignment happens simultaneously. So for example, if A, B, C, and D are the four chunks of the Frère Jacques tune, so A is Frère Jacques, B is Dormez-vous, C is, what's the next phrase? Sonne la matine, D is ding dong dong, or whatever they say that in French, then A, B, C, D is the Frère Jacques tune. If I just wrote A, B, C, D, and again A, B, C, D under it, that would mean two people singing Frère Jacques at the same time. And doing it this way indicates that it's being done as a canon. So like at the first, what's that?
It's like a round.
Exactly. It's a kind of, I mean, canon, round is a particular kind of canon that includes, as we'll see, Frère and various artists. But yeah, exactly. In some rounds they're even actually printed where they give you actual music notation, but they say A, B, C, D. And you know that one of you sings the A, one of you sings the B, etc. And so for instance, BA, B on top of A means, remember, this is A, this is B, this is A. So A followed by B on top of A, followed by C on top of B. Right, this is B, this is C, so together. And then D on top of C. And finally the top voice takes the rest and the bottom voice finishes its D. So that's like my scheme of a musical score for Frère Jacques done as a two-part canon, or yes, a two-part round. And if it were a three-part round, I would just put a third voice here. I've gone too far up. I'll just put a third voice here and do this, and then the fourth part, if there is one, would go here, and there is no point for a fifth part because that would just repeat where I started. So that's sort of a scheme for any musical canon. So if I did instead of three blind mice, instead of Frère Jacques, I did three blind mice, then A would be three blind mice, three blind mice. B would be see how they run, see how they run. C would be whatever the text is for that. D would be and then the two together would be B on top of A, C on top of B, D on top of C, and D alone. Okay, so that's going to be our general scheme for writing, not music notation, but like patterns of music notation. And you might think, well, this doesn't look like music notation, it looks like something else, it looks like algebra. And given Dean's introduction, you might not be surprised that people who hear that I've been doing music and math since a very young age are often asked the question, well, what's the relation between math, which I might represent by this forbidding integral sign, can you see it? There it is, and music. And one must admit that usually most of the connections people try to draw between math and music aren't much more deeper and revealing than this little silly visual pun, but there are a few places, including musical canons, where a mathematical or scientific way of thinking can actually lead you to some insights or ideas that you might not have seen otherwise. So the first thing to ask is, put on your scientist hat and say, first of all, there's a question of what scientists call the null hypothesis. That is to say, how do I know there is anything to explain at all? Maybe the way to construct a canon is to do nothing more than what I have indicated in this diagram that I now can't find because it's probably hiding under this sheet. No? Oh, it's up here? Anyway, this ABCD diagram, you all remember what it looks like, right? Right, so just take any old tune, split it up into 4 parts, let's say. Maybe more parts if it's longer. Have part B do that, and then B is going to work with A, and C is going to work with B, and it all will be nice and, a nice musical canon. So let's try that. Let's do an experiment with another tune. This tune has many different names and lyrics. You know it as the alphabet song. Mozart wrote a whole set of variations for it under a French title. I learned it in Hebrew. It's also Baba Black Sheep. And if it were a canon, then it would work like this. A, B on top of A, C on top of B. Okay, maybe my A's and B's are too long. No. So in principle, this is a canon in the sense that it looks like this, it satisfies the condition of falling into this scheme, but remember, letters that are on top of each other represent bits of music that are sounding together and are supposed to sound good together. This isn't happening here, right? This C over B was this. And I mean, it's been many years since you could say that this is literally not music, but it's not in the same musical language that's implied by, I mean, that's what Mozart does. If he did, nobody would listen to it. And so there's actually two conditions here. It has to be a reasonable tune, and when you put it in this scheme, B and A have to sound good together. And I'm not going to be able to define what it means for B and A to sound good together, both because this is not a course in music theory, and because it depends on what kind of music you're writing. People are writing canons from the age of Schütz to Schubert to Shostakovich, and each one of them has a different sense of what it means for two tunes to sound good together. So I'll take this to be some, something that is fed into the system. You tell me what it means for two chunks of music to sound good together, and under some natural assumptions, like things sound good to themselves, I'll be able to tell you how to write canons. But for now, I think you'll agree that I've disproved the null hypothesis. That is to say, it's not simply true that any tune you take will work with itself in canon, and in fact, I haven't proven this yet, but you can experiment on your own. Almost any tune that you try that was not built to sound good as a canon is not going to. And the exceptions are there are some exceptions that appear, but they're usually for structural reasons, like it's a very repetitive tune, and so you only have to be lucky once, and then if B works with A, then C and B are almost the same as B and A. It's the same tune 3 times over, so once you know that this works, then the next few iterations have to work as well. But with a few interesting exceptions like that, the null hypothesis can't be true, and so there's actually something to explain. And, okay, so next thing is going to be, I'm going to take off my scientist hat, which is not fitting all that well because I'm a mathematician, not a scientist, and I'll put on my mathematician's hat and try to ask for what we sometimes know in mathematics as trivial solutions. Now, trivial is a rather notorious word in mathematics and in related fields because it can be used to do what's sometimes known as proof by intimidation. Oh, why is this true? It's trivial. That is to say, if you don't understand this, then you're being dumb or something like that. It does have some technical senses. The word, by the way, comes from the Latin for three ways. That is to say, it's a fork in the road, or 3 ways meet, and there are several explanations for why that became what we now call as trivial, but one of them is because that's where people stopped and made small talk. Putting that aside too, trivial solutions, one thing we learn in mathematics is even when they are not very interesting in their own right, like every linear equation has a solution of 0. That's not interesting in its own, but it's sort of at the basis of all the developments that you do on top of it, and that sometimes works in other places too. So let's try to make some trivial canons. So I mentioned one of my basic assumptions about this relation. I'm going to introduce the notation A tilde B means that A and B sound good together, whatever that means. For our purposes, it means I'm allowed to put A and B with each other in counterpoint. So it will be allowed for A and B to be consecutive in a canon tune. And I need an axiom which is all A sound good with themselves. So A is always going to work with A. Okay, if you grant me this axiom, which I mentioned already, right? I mean, this or, I mean, this sounds, it's not a very interesting counterpoint, it's trivial counterpoint, just two people saying the same thing, but at least isn't clashing in the way that this did. It's not as interesting as, or even, but at least it's acceptable. And okay, if you grant me that, well, here is a canon. It's going to be a 3-part canon or a 4-part canon. And now you might say, well, okay, this is really trivial, A. But remember, this is not just the note A. It's any musical chunk that can play the part of A. Now you might think that's not all that interesting either, because well, who cares about this canon? But musicians have over the years found many ways of expanding on or of working out things that are basically this, but sound more interesting. So instead of just A or a single repeating tune, it could be anything on, let's say, an A major chord, right? So, for example, I mentioned Shostakovich before. Everybody knows, quote unquote, everybody knows that Bach wrote a famous set of preludes and fugues. Shostakovich wrote one too. One in every key, and the A major one that's the theme. And it's built up entirely of notes of the A major scale. Of course, it doesn't stay in A major chord, not just scale. It doesn't just stay in that. It's a neat piece of music, and because it's a fugue, almost every fugue at some point has to end with what's called a stretto, which is basically the fugue part, the climactic canon of a fugue, where the theme appears in canon with itself. And in this case, because it's all an A major chord, anything he does is going to work. He actually has it in 3 parts. And so forth. And so, I mean, it's just an A major chord, so at some point it's not as interesting as, which is Mozart's A major canon, but it does work in, as you know, some kind of point of repose where and it's not just playing the same thing with itself. So that's one way to develop a canon that hides or is built on this kind of trivial AAA canon. Another is to have this be not a single chord, but a repeating progression of chords. Like the famous Pachelbel canon. because it has to. As long as the harmony always, as long as the melody always fits within this chord, anything you put above it is going to be, you know, if you let A be the, if you take for A the 8-chord sequence in Pachelbel, basically anything you do is going to make a reasonable canon. Or to give a simpler example, so let's see, what did I just do? What else can I do with this one? Yeah, this is why 3-blind mice works. It's basically A with this progression, and we have a sense that ultimately it's, you know, going round and round on itself, and it's probably why we often call this kind of A canon a round. The Pachelbel canon is just long enough that we don't think of it as a round, but it's pretty much the same kind of thing. And by the way, if I have two different realizations of the A, they can be played with each other. So I mentioned before 3-blind mice. That's the same progression. Which means that this should work. Playing 3-blind mice in one hand and whatever the other one is called, Ferre-Jacques in the other. And in fact, I could have split the audience here in half and have half of you sing, you know, Ferre-Jacques A, and half of you sing Ferre-Jacques B, and then a third of you sing 3-blind mice A, 3-blind mice B, 3-blind mice C, and maybe the folks in the back will sing 3-blind mice D, and I could find two other groups to sing Ferre-Jacques C and D, and it will all work together as a big double canon in 4 parts, all of which is basically variations of this. So this and a few other such simple constructions are what are known as rounds. The other one, by the way, right, so this all use the axiom that A always works with itself. The other such axiom is that if A works with B, oops, which way does this go? Oh, here we go. If A works with B, then B probably works with A. If I can go, then it could go the other way around, what's called invertible counterpoint. With B and A switching parts. And likewise, more generally, if A, B, and C go together, then probably B, C, and A go together, and probably C, A, and B go together, which means if you have figured out some bit of counterpoint, like A, B, and C go together, and you can convince yourself that you can follow A with C, and C with B, and B with A, and make a tune out of it, well, why did I do it this way as opposed to A, B, C? It would work either way. Oh, probably so that I get A, B, C going down here as opposed to A, C, B. And that's how rounds like Dona Nobis Pacem work. If you Dona Nobis Pacem, Pacem, if you have sung that one. And again, it's written so that usually if you do read it in music, there's a single line of music and it says A starts here, B starts here, C starts here, and you could have just written it as 3 vertical lines, you know, 3 not parallel lines, so you sing A, you sing A, then you go here and you sing B, then you go here and sing C, and then you come back, and people start at different parts of it, so at each point you have A, B, and C sounding together. So that's another kind of round. But this does not account for all of the canons that I started the example, that I started my lecture with. It does not account for Mozart's, and it doesn't account for it can't, because there's actually, you know, what musicians talk about as harmonic movement here. It doesn't stay on the same chord or on the same, you know, short cycle of chords. It starts from one place and goes to another place. And likewise for the Beethoven fourth example and most other interesting canons. And so I'm going to indicate how one goes about constructing an actual canon that's not just a round. And so I mentioned before, one thing that mathematicians do is look for trivial solutions. Another thing is to see like what are good choices of the parameter. And of course that's not just a mathematical thing, but one obvious parameter is, I mentioned there could be a canon 2 parts, a canon 3 parts, and 4 parts, and so forth. What is the simplest, what is the first choice of n for which I should think about making an n-part canon? I see 2. Any lower bids? Any higher bids? Okay. When I give this talk at places like Harvard, there is usually some smart aleck who says, never mind 1, 0. I'm glad to say there are no smart alecks like this here. I hope you enjoyed the 0-part canon that I just performed. Unless you are big fans of John Cage, I think you can put aside 0-part canons. As for 1-part canons, what's a 1-part canon? Yeah, it's just a melody, right? I mean, if I have the same kind of diagram I showed before with A, B, C, D, and so forth, and this being a 2-part canon, the 1-part version of this would just be A, B, C, D, E, etc. It would just be the melody. There's no quote-unquote vertical condition. There's no condition things should go together with each other. You just need to be able to write a good tune. Just be able to write a good tune. I mean, that's an art in itself. But as with counterpoint, I have to assume that you can write tunes and that you can do counterpoint before I can even, you know, try to get at writing canonical counterpoint, which involves both tunes and harmony. So I have to assume that we know how to do that, and then the first case where we actually have a task to make a canon is for n equals 2. And so let's see how we make a 2-part canon. Now we already mentioned it's not just a matter of writing a tune and then declaring that it's a canon by having another part sing it a measure or two behind, because usually that will produce chaos. And so I let you in on a trick or technique or algorithm that practically everybody who ever learned how to write canons, be it Schütz or be it Shostakovich, uses this basic method. And the idea is the following. So suppose I'm going to write a canon, starting, and it's going to be the same A, B, etc. Scheme. So maybe A is going to be, I don't know, it's a reasonable way to start a, you know, common practice musical tune. Okay, and I'm going to keep going. No, I'm not going to keep going yet, because as soon as I have written all of my A, I know exactly what's going to happen in the next unit of time in voice 2. And so I know already that whatever B is, it has to not just make sense the continuation of the tune, it also has to be harmonic with A. We have to have A twiddle B, or B twiddle A, which we're assuming is the same thing. So as soon as I've written my A, I know whatever happens had better make sense with this. So maybe, okay, so that's a B. That's B and A sounding together. And then, of course, once I have my B, I know what's happening in a third unit of time in the bottom voice. And then, so that will be A, B on top of A, and then B. And now I know what C has to do. C has to continue this musical thought while being consistent with the harmony of B. So maybe so that would be C. And you know, once I've shown you 3 of these, you can figure out the pattern continues in that way. At each stage, I'm going to add a chunk on the top, use it to continue the bottom, and then see what that requires me to do in the next. Okay. Sounds like I've reached a reasonable ending point, except there's one final wrinkle, right? So this happened to be H. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, E, F, G, H. But the bottom part inevitably kept going after the top part was done. I mean, it has to be that way, right? If the bottom part is doing the same music and starts a bit later, it has to end a bit later. Now, it makes some kind of rhetorical sense for parts to come in one at a time into the conversation. It's not as common in music for parts to leave off one at a time, you know, leaving just a few performers on stage while the others are already packing up their instruments. The Farewell Symphony is a famous exception that proves the rule. It's a piece that Haydn wrote where exactly that happens to hint to Haydn's patron that the musicians have not had a vacation. And so half of them are leaving the stage while, you know, the few violins are left on the front of the stage to do that, and everybody else already left. But usually when you write a piece of music, you want everybody to end together. And you can't do that while maintaining the canon all the way to the end. So almost everybody writes canons, even very strict canonical writers like Bach, will allow themselves the following 1.5 bits of freedom. One is that they will let the bottom voice dispense with the final bit of the tune, so instead of, they'll just have, and then you're even allowed to change the last bit just slightly to make it a more convincing ending. So instead of maybe, which sounds a lot more like the end of a piece of music. So mathematicians sometimes use a prime to denote something that's like almost G but a bit different. So so there's going to be some H which is unconstrained except that it's constrained by having to be a reasonable end of the piece. And then there's a G prime that's constrained to be almost the same as G and to go together with H and to also be a good ending. So that canon that I've been sort of constructing here is so that's how you make a canon, and I didn't actually make this one on the spot here, even though I could have. That is to say, if this basic kind of two-part canon, which is not just a round, but it's just consisting of 2 parts, and each one of them is copying the second one exactly, as opposed to doing something more complicated, like maybe doing upside down, or going backwards, or being played twice as fast, that kind of thing, you can actually make up in real time. That is to say, I can improvise such a canon, and I'm about to do that. And of course, if I do that, you will then ask, well, how do I know that this time you really were improvising as opposed to just playing? Again, something that you have written in advance and performed already when you gave a talk previously at MCSU. And the way to be sure of that is to temporarily take off my mathematician's hat and to put on the computer scientist hat and say that what I'm looking for here is what computer scientists sometimes call a protocol. That is to say, a procedure, a rule for interaction that will give you some evidence that I am in fact doing what I claim to do, which is I'm making up a canon as opposed to just reproducing a pre-written one. And a single iteration of a protocol doesn't necessarily give you automatic proof, but if you imagine that you're able to iterate it lots of times, it will be very hard for you to believe that I'm, in each case, just being very lucky that you started me off with a tune that I already knew. So the way this protocol works is somebody from the audience whom I don't know, so not you, start me off with some tune, with some chunk of tune, this A, and I'm going to make something up using basically this procedure that will be a somewhat more extended, but still, like a short canon. So somebody pipe up with, a whistle or a hum or something that will tell me what A is going to be.
You start with the G minor.
What's that?
G minor chord.
Just the G minor chord?
G, D, E flat.
G, D,
E flat.
E flat.
D, C, E flat.
Oh, okay. You're raising your hand too. Maybe I'll do yours next. Think about it.
I was thinking of melody and making, so the minor faked me out.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well, we can do it afterwards. So. Maybe I have time to do yours also if you figure it out.
Yeah, sure. So, mi, re, do, ti, do.
Sol, mi, re, do, ti. In that rhythm?
Yeah.
Okay, let's see what that is. Maybe do it to the left hand start this time. allowing myself more liberties towards the end, but I'm not claiming to be Bach. So, okay, so now you know at least the basics of how both rounds and canons are constructed. How much time do I have roughly? Well, fine, but what time is it? It's 9:09. Okay, so I started almost an hour ago. So maybe I'll just finish by telling you one little bit about canons in more than 2 parts. And okay, let's try to construct a canon in 3 parts. I'm not going to do it at the piano. So we know what it's going to look like. Now before I showed you what would happen, so for Frère Jacques I had A here, B here, C. Why do I have to do that? Why don't I start the third part some other place? Well, here's one. Okay, so suppose I'm going to construct a canon that looks like this, with the third part coming in not at the same interval to the second as the second to the first, but 2 units later. Okay, so I start with my A, and as soon as I have this A, I know this A is going to happen here and also here. And then I need some B that will continue this A, okay, and will work with this A, and I can do that. Fine. Okay, now what does C have to do? C has to continue B, of course, which it will do in each one of the parts, and it has to fit with B, but it also has to fit with A unit later. That's a much harder task. That requires a chunk of music to work both with one thing and with something else, which as far as we know is no harmonic connection to it. I mean, yes, B is assumed to be going with A, but that doesn't mean that C can go with both of them, unless they're all basically the same A, which is going to bring us back to a trivial AAA canon. Right? So C has to satisfy both of these conditions and go both with B and with A, and then D is going to have to go both with C and with B, and suddenly it becomes much harder not just to make this up on the spot, but to make this work at all. There's very few canons I know that work this way, and almost every canon in 3 parts does in fact do what I indicated at first, because that way, having chosen your initial A, your initial B seems to have to do 3 things also. It has to go with something from 1 to 2 and from 2 to 3, but it only has to go, the condition between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 are the same. So, in fact, I only have one condition to satisfy. Now this C, I forgot to mention before, this D here doesn't have to just go together with both C and with B. It has to go together with C and A at the same time. So everything past the first 3 chunks are going to have to satisfy both the condition of making musical sense with what happened before, and of working with 2 existing notes, with 2 existing chunks, and of working with some completely different thing. Whereas here, yeah, the new C is going to have to work with both B and A, but once it does that, the next condition works automatically. So at each turn, I have one fewer condition to deal with. Namely, D has to work with C and B, and of course to continue C, but it doesn't also have to know anything about A. And likewise, E has to work with D and C, but no longer with B, etc. So almost every 3-part canon is going to be with this scheme. And for those of you who know about intervals and so forth, if it's a canon where the 2 parts are not at the same starting pitch, but are off by some other interval, like in the Brahms example, it's not, which would be literally the same note. So it's not the same tune. I mean, it's the same tune, but it's in a different key. The same key relation is going to hold between voices 1 and 2 and voices 2 and 3. And I'll finish maybe by, right, so there's plenty of other kinds of canons one can imagine. Canons in augmentation, where one voice is twice as fast as the other, or upside down canons, where maybe the bottom voice, oh, sorry. That, where maybe if the top voice is, then the bottom voice instead of would be playing every note back upside down. That, I mean, playing all the intervals upside down. So like, everybody know, anybody here heard the Paganini variations by Rachmaninoff? That's Paganini. Rachmaninoff wrote a set of variations, of which the most famous is this is much simpler than what he wrote. I'm not young, so I'm not going to be able to play it correctly. But the point is, it's a variation because it's playing the tune upside down instead of it's sorry. So it's playing the same tune upside down, and then, you know, maybe in that case, the canon, the picture looks something like, you know, A, B, C, D, upside down A, upside down B. Well, an upside down B and C look much the same, but I could cheat and make it look like this. Anyhow, or I could do both at the same time. Where the bottom part is the top part at half speed and upside down. So there's lots of things like that, but for lack of time, I will finish with the one canon, well, one of the few canons I know that actually works like this, and it's usually set to the lyrics of Non nobis domine, not to us, O Lord, but to thee be glory given, as if this is something that wasn't even constructed, but somehow discovered or revealed to the person who first wrote it down. And the tune is Non nobis domine, non nobis, sed nomini tua da gloriam, sed nomini tua da gloriam. In two parts. Parts instead of it doesn't quite work, it comes close, but this C against A business, right, the third voice with the first one doesn't quite work, but it's constructed to be this pattern. So instead of what I started playing, which would have been a normal three-part canon, it works like this. Thanks, and if there are any questions,
Thank you very much, Ken, for a very exciting talk. Are there any questions for our guest? Maybe you want to know how he did that on the piano?
Can you say something about the fugue as a sequential construct also?
So a fugue, there are various different kinds of fugue, but I think I mentioned in passing, a fugue is a particular kind of counterpoint, which one way of thinking about it is that it's a way of combining all of the different kinds of so it's almost always going to start with, it's going to be some theme, and then that theme will be introduced in one voice, and then there'll be another voice taking it up, while the first voice does something else. And then there'll be usually at least 3 voices. There is often some episodes between them. This particular fugue has 5 parts, which is rather unusual. They're usually 3 or sometimes 4. If you're keeping count, I'm only playing 4 notes at once. One of the voices is taking the rest. So now the first time we hear all 5. Etc. And often, depending on what the composer is trying to do, there can be several different themes. So this one has at least one other theme, which is often constructed so that it works together. And there's various of these contrapuntal schemes or diagrams that the composer can aim to realize. And of course, I'm oversimplifying a lot because ultimately it's ideally when you have a composer writing fugue, that somebody like Bach who's so internalized this way of writing, what's the word? It's almost a I'm forgetting the language. It's a kind of musical texture that he speaks so fluently that he can realize his musical thoughts in the language of fugue. This is the way that most of us, have, So, Bach would have except he'd make an actual fugue out of that. But there are various different kinds of these patterns that, so there might be if you have a subject, there's going to be a counter subject S that will happen as A plays. You might eventually have the themes overlapping, and that's what's called a stretto. For some reason, it's from the Latin word for stretched, but that's where canons come into fugues. So at the climax of a fugue, you usually have a canon. So the fugue I started, which is the Bach C sharp minor, there is eventually, how does it go? And you hear that not only the main theme, but also the second theme is coming together itself. So there's a little canon there, and it's basically so one way of thinking about it, a bunch of little canons that have become themselves the building blocks of this bigger texture of a kind of fugue. That's not the only way that you can make. It's one common way of building up a larger structure out of canons. There are others. One thing that I brought with me and never had a chance to show, except that I mentioned canons which are an augmentation. This is also by Brahms. And okay, I'm sorry, this is actual music notation, but music notation is basically a graph of pitch against time. So look at just the top voice. As you keep going here, time, so this happens after that, and basically higher circles mean higher notes. So and everything that happens at the same time is on the same vertical line. And the thing to notice here is that the bass is the same thing as the soprano, except at half speed. And so the one thing that's happening in this piece, which is Brahms's setting from the 51st Psalm, is that there is this big canon, but besides the canon between the soprano and the bass, there's all these little canons that are hiding that is not a fugue, but it's a kind of fugue in that it's a texture which is made up of little canonical parts and other counterpoint. So that's one way of answering your question. I'm sorry, I'm not going to try to give a music theory class here about fugues. But it's canons are in some sense, just like these basic tunes are building blocks for canons. Canons can be building blocks for fugues, for this kind of motet, for various other kinds of music.
Let's take
Yeah.
So, do you think canons are also related to concepts like periodic tiling or tessellation?
Periodic tiling or tessellation? It's actually a round is closer to a periodic tiling than a fugue, than a canon, right? I mean, a canon is, if you imagine the score of a canon, it's periodic in one direction, that everything that happens here happened here also, but the thing that makes it not a round is that it's not periodic in this direction. The tune, eventually comes to a stop, but doesn't give you a hint that it's just repeating the same thing over and over again. Whereas the round, does actually repeat in both dimensions. So, in some sense, it's maybe not. Canons are not so much like a tessellation as, this Escher print called Metamorphosen, which is this really long, it would literally start here and we'd run out of room in displaying it. And it's a series of these small tessellations, but they all meld one into each other. And it never, at the very end it repeats, but along the way you have bees and birds and castles and a chess position. And it's all, each one of them is locally tessellated, but it's sort of like a big canon running from the beginning of the Metamorphosen to the end of it. So that would be maybe the closest kind of, thing between a tessellation and musical canon. I think there was a question there.
When you're trying to determine what melody will sound good with what came before, do you think about consonant intervals or being part of the same chord or the same harmonic function?
Okay, this is really what they call inside baseball, I think, except there is some of each. What you're mentioning are all tools that we use to teach or to analyze what makes two things sound good together, whether they realize the same, where they realize the same chord, like I was indicating with, does this sound good together because the intervals are consonant, because they're parallel thirds, because they're realizing the same harmony. There are different analytical models, and in some sense, I guess it's what physicists would call the superposition of all of those. At some point, you get used to a particular kind of musical language, and then it almost becomes second nature. So, if I didn't know it was, I don't know. I'm making something up, and I can't tell you for each particular chord that I choose it because I'm trying to modulate or because I'm trying to make a counterpoint or whatever, but it's part of the language that I speak, not as well as people like Mendelssohn did, but well enough to do this. And, it's like, we're improvising now, right? We're speaking words that none of us have spoken before. We're not thinking of what's the next adverb that goes here, should this end with an S for a plural? It's sort of, we already know how to do that internally. That's the kind of thing we think about when we're learning a foreign language. By now, this is not a foreign language to me. So.
You can do the time for the last question.
Okay.
I was just trying to understand the upside down part when you were talking about.
Okay.
When you were playing it, I couldn't.
I'm sorry, I went by too quickly on that. Upside down means everything that goes up goes down and vice versa. So basically, instead of upside down would be, so upside down is, and it's it's a transformation that we can sort of hear as, so it's the same general contour of the music, but it just goes the opposite way. So like, is upside down of, yeah, it can have that effect of sounding funny because it's clearly a version of it, but it's not the right version. It's like playing Happy Birthday to You. But yeah, it's a standard kind of transformation, and some of the Bach fugues actually play the theme upside down. So instead of, there you go. What's that? No, that's a different that's a good question. That's a different transformation. Canons that go backwards are sometimes called crab canons, but those are very hard for us to hear. There's even some people in computer science who have a model of computation which explains why we can recognize tunes upside down but not backwards. We basically have to remember half the tune to recognize it. That's a very unusual transformation, but it's a good question. If you put a page of music upside down, you're playing it both up, you're playing both the notes upside down and you're playing backwards, so it will not sound anything like what you started. You have to look at it in the mirror.
Noam will be here to answer questions privately, but let's stop here and let's thank Noam for a wonderful evening. Thank you to all of you for coming.